language matters, neurotypical versus psychotypical, neurodivergent versus psychodivergent. If you look on Google, neurotypical has thousands and thousands of results, maybe over 1 million. Psychotypical does not have many results, maybe in the 100 to 1,000 or so. I am trying to suggest that psychotypical is a more useful and accurate term than neurotypical in the context of psychiatry and so on and so forth. So neurotypical versus neurodivergent or neuroatypical might imply that people have something different going on with their brains. Psychodivergent or psychoatypical may imply that people simply have a different way of thinking about things. So for example, you could have the same identical television as someone else, the same model of television. Suppose you had a Samsung television or some other brand. You could be playing two different movies on those televisions. Physically speaking, the televisions are identical. When a television is playing something, the pixels are lighting up differently. Again, let's say you have two people in two different rooms watching two different movies on two different televisions on the same model of television. The televisions can both function just fine, be perfectly working televisions, they aren't broken, but yet they, again, functioning as they should, can be displaying different pixel light patterns on the screen. So in one sense, they're the same. In another sense, they're slightly different. When we use the term neurotypical or neuroatypical, I feel like there are downsides to that. It reinforces the idea that people with certain psychiatric disorders have something wrong with their brain. So for example, a schizophrenic, quote unquote, somebody labeled as psychotic or schizophrenic or schizoaffective, I believe, unless we prove otherwise, we should assume they have a healthy brain. Yet, people who are diagnosed with psychosis and schizophrenia are sometimes voluntarily and sometimes involuntarily made to ingest certain psychiatric drugs, or persuaded to. And these drugs can have side effects that can result in death. So for example, neuroleptics such as, I think, clozaril, Haldol, olanzapine, there's a decent amount of them. They can have side effects, some of them, like diabetes, weight gain, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, heart issues that can, I believe, result in arrhythmias and hence result in death. That's my understanding of the side effects. I might be wrong. Maybe look them up yourself. So we use pseudo-medical justifications to justify coercing people into ingesting certain potentially deadly psychiatric drugs because we say they are mentally ill and they have something wrong with their brain that makes them unaware of their medical problem, which is really a pseudo-medical problem. So we persuade them or force them to, or coerce them into ingesting like antipsychotics, for example. So neurotypical versus neuroatypical linguistically reinforces the idea that they have something different with their brain and therefore maybe should be on antipsychotic drugs, which can result in death, whether they want to or not, because they have something wrong with their brain, making them a danger to themselves or others. So therefore it justifies forcing them to ingest or coercing them to ingest potentially deadly psychiatric drugs. If we conceptualize things as psychotypical versus psychoatypical, it's suggesting that there's nothing wrong with their brain, it's just they think differently about things. So again, back to the television analogy, if we have two identical televisions in two different rooms with two different people watching them, one has a horror movie playing on it and the other has, a space western or whatever genres you want to think of that are two different genres. Again, the televisions are functioning perfectly fine, but yet one person who doesn't like horror movies might be watching the horror movie on the television and be disgusted and not feel good about it. And the person watching the space western may like space westerns and have a great time, or vice versa. So psychoatypical versus psychotypical, neurotypical versus neuroatypical, language matters. That's what I'm trying to convey here. So, we use language and it spreads. When we use words, we reinforce it in others. Whether we want to or not. Another thing, which maybe I'll make another video about, is the term, crazy. We don't use, we find it socially inappropriate to use certain racial slurs because they're offensive to people that maybe, for a variety of historical and cultural reasons, certain racial slurs are offensive. So words like, oh, that's a crazy day, or that person's crazy, that could be offensive to people who maybe find crazy to be a slur for people that have been diagnosed with certain psychiatric disorders. And as an aside, I'm a huge fan of the books by psychiatrist Thomas Szasz. I encourage you to check him out if you want to. He wrote books like Psychiatric Slavery, Our Right to Drugs, A Case for a Free Market, Cruel Compassion, Insanity, The Idea and Its Consequences. He wrote a lot of books. I would encourage you to read them. Psychiatrist Thomas Szasz. I'm going off on a tangent here. In fact, forget what I was going to say. Back to neurotypical versus neuroatypical versus neurodivergent versus psychotypical versus psychoatypical versus psychodivergent. Oh, and by the way, one of Thomas Szasz's books is called Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry. So, for example, somebody who has neurosyphilis, they get syphilis because they do something sort of foolish, or not foolish, but more risky than they should have, or, maybe foolish depending on what they're doing, if they know better, but they do it anyway and they get syphilis and they don't treat it with antibiotics or however doctors recommend they treat it, and it's going to start affecting their brain, neurosyphilis, it can eventually kill them. And it did kill people before we had a treatment for neurosyphilis. Neurosyphilis is a neurological disorder. Alzheimer's is a neurological disorder. My understanding is that through autopsies, they can diagnose post-mortem neurosyphilis and Alzheimer's and brain tumors. So if somebody has a brain tumor and dies, or an Alzheimer's and dies, or neurosyphilis and dies, well, there's objective medical ways to determine what bodily disease someone has. But for things like psychosis and schizophrenia, there is no objective medical way of diagnosing psychosis and schizophrenia as psychiatric disorders. They talk to people and ask them questions. So we use pseudo-medical justifications to lock people up with certain psychiatric disorders. Thomas Szasz talks about sick from above versus sick from below. Sick from below, in terms of psychiatry, is you go to a psychiatrist or whoever and say, I feel like I have a mental disorder, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, whatever. And you get a psychiatric diagnosis, and maybe you take drugs or go to counseling or whatever, but you're seeking out that diagnosis. Sick from above is when people with more power than you or whatever people with more power than the patient say, you're sick, you are psychotic, you are schizophrenic, you are schizoaffective. And maybe that person agrees or they don't. In most cases, when it's sick from above, they don't agree. They say, no, I just believe this, or I feel this way. And people with power and medical degrees say, you're sick, you have a psychiatric disorder, you're a danger to yourself or others, and you need to be treated. And on that note, if somebody is authentically a danger to themselves, if somebody is authentically a danger to others, they have broken a law. If you are plotting and planning, if you have a plans, mean, and intention of harming others, and that can be proven, well, you've broken a law. If I'm planning to go, if anybody's planning to go do something horrible and harm others, and they get caught for that, well, that's like conspiracy or whatever. I'm not a lawyer, but from what I understand, people have been caught planning and plotting to do horrible things, and they're caught before they actually do it, and they go to jail for that. That's illegal. So if you are authentically a danger to others, that's, again, not an authentic self-defense. Well, you or whoever that person is, again, if they're authentically a danger to others, in the sense they're planning on doing something and that can be proven, it's my understanding, again, I'm not a lawyer, but it's my understanding that they're breaking a law and they should be held criminally responsible. Psychiatrist Thomas Szasz wrote a whole book called Insanity, the Idea and Its Consequences, which is about why there should be no insanity defense. It's like a 300-page book, all about why there should be no insanity defense. And then Szasz wrote 2 books, one called Suicide Prohibition, the Shame of Medicine, and the other called Fatal Freedom, the Ethics and Politics of Suicide, which is all about why we should respect suicide as a civil and human right. And I agree with that. I'm not pro-suicide. I do not encourage suicide. I hope nobody wants to engage in suicide. I hope we can use persuasion, reason, and kindness so that all humans want to live on Earth. That would be nice. If we could have Earth be so awesome nobody wants to leave by their own hands, that means Earth is pretty freaking awesome. But right now in the United States, in the last 20 years, the suicide rate has gone up by about like 30 or 40%. You can look it up. Just, search suicide rate USA on a search engine. Historical suicide rate chart USA. You can find this yourself. And in the last 50, 60 years, the disability rate for psychiatric disorders has skyrocketed. I would encourage you to read the book Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker. It has a pretty long subtitle, which I can't remember, but it's a good book. Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker. The whole premise of this book is asking the question, if mainstream biological psychiatry, which relies on drugs, you're depressed, have a drug, you're psychotic, have a drug. If mainstream psychiatry is so effective, the mainstream medical model of psychiatry, if it's effective, why has the disability rate for psychiatric disorders, both like, affective disorders and anxiety disorders and psychotic disorders, why has the disability rate skyrocketed over the last 50 years if the medical psychiatric paradigm is so effective? So again, back to neurotypical versus psychotypical. So if you are using the term neurotypical versus neurodivergent, you are, again, through your language, suggesting brains are different. So again, if you get 2 different models of televisions in 2 different rooms with 2 different people, is that the same television? Is one a neurotypical television? If you're playing a TV show that's really common, you're watching Seinfeld, that's a typical show, or The Simpsons, so your television is television typical. But then if you're watching a show that's less common, like a cult classic or whatever, or something that nobody's ever heard of hardly, is your television atypical because you're watching a different television show? I think it's ridiculous. So, but again, you could language is fun to play with. Language is very powerful. According to psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, the word is our strongest drug. Believe it or not, I believe it was in his book, The Medicalization of Everyday Life, where he talks about the power of language and how he says something to the effect of that the mind is its own opiate and the word is its most powerful drug. It's close to the quote. Again, I'm pretty sure it was Medicalization of Everyday Life. where he says that, but he definitely, unless I'm misremembering, I don't think I am, he says the word is our strongest drug. So words matter. So, psychotypical versus psychodivergent does not imply there's any brain difference between people with autism or psychosis or schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. Because a perfectly healthy brain, like take depression for example, somebody with a perfectly healthy brain can be miserable. Think about it. Somebody with a perfectly healthy brain can feel anxiety. If we medicalize those things, that can have unintended consequences. I like to say, and I believe, depression is medicalized misery. Depression is medicalized misery. People have reasons for feeling depressed. People have reasons for feeling hopeless. People have reasons for feeling fearful, in terms of anxiety. People may have their own personal reasons for saying things that some deem as psychotic. For example, to psychiatrist Thomas Saz, again, if my memory serves me, having read about 10 to 15 of his books, somewhere in there, 12 to 15, something like that. I can talk about Saz all day, but I'm going off on a tangent. Anyway, you don't have to agree with me. You're welcome to keep saying, if you say neurotypical versus neuroatypical, feel free to keep saying that. If you find that helpful, great. Keep using that language. I personally think psychotypical versus psychoatypical versus psychodivergent, I think that's more linguistically accurate, linguistically helpful, because it does not linguistically give a tiny bit of power to those people that say schizophrenia and psychosis are brain diseases. And suppose they are brain diseases, which, again, in theory, before we knew what neurosyphilis was, we didn't know it was a brain disease. We didn't know what it was necessarily. I mean, it did seem to do something to the brain and the face, so people could theorize, but until we had a treatment for it that actually worked, we don't know. So could schizophrenia be a brain disease? Well, until we prove that it is, I don't feel like it's reasonable to assume that it is. In fact, I feel like it's unreasonable to assume that it is. People can believe all sorts of weird things and not have a brain disease. Or people can believe things you don't agree with, to put it more mildly, and not have a brain disease. Buddhists believe in reincarnation. Catholics believe in the doctrine of transubstantiation, where the Eucharist literally becomes the body and blood of Christ. So are they all psychotic? Are Buddhists psychotic for thinking they're going to die and come back to life as another human or an animal or whatever? This video is not perfect, I'm going to admit that. I didn't script it. I just talk off the cuff. But my point, I hope you think about it. Neurotypical versus neuroatypical. I'm an artist. I like to freestyle rap sometimes. And you can like my art or not like it. I really don't care. Well, it's nice people like it because I listen to it, and that's good in certain ways. But this video is a piece of art, in my opinion, in certain ways. Consider it poetry. Some of it may make sense to you, some of it may not. It makes sense to me. That's what's important to me. And I'm pretty sure out of the 7 billion humans on Earth, this is going to make sense to someone else a little bit. One thing psychiatrist Thomas Saz said is, this is almost an exact quote, is trying to find a organic or biological etiology of any mental disease is like trying to measure the caloric content of food for thought? Can you measure the caloric content of food for thought? That might be in the Saz Quotationary, which is a great book. I'd recommend it, the Saz Quotationary. And another thing, and again, Saz has influenced me significantly, so I'll give Saz credit for this. But as soon as you find an organic cause or a biological cause of a mental disorder, it's not a mental disorder anymore. It's a bodily disorder, and neurologists should treat it if it's a problem with the brain. So, if someone is saying a bunch of weird stuff and sounds, psychotic or whatever, and they really have a urinary tract infection, well, they don't have, well, that's different, but, or let's say they are considered psychotic or schizophrenia, and they actually just have a brain tumor, and you remove it, well, they didn't have a psychiatric disorder. They had a brain disorder. They only had a psychiatric disorder insofar as that we want to pervert the medical model. If you ignore the potential for a biological cause of psychiatric disorders and just try to treat the psychiatric disorder as something wrong with the mind, which is thought to have something wrong with the brain, well, that's going to have unintended consequences. So this video is by no means perfect. I'll give you that. As I'm making this video, I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't post it because I sort of go off some tangents and whatever else. But I'm probably going to post it anyway. A picture's worth 1,000 words, as some might say. And if a video is, 30 frames per second approximately, then 1 minute of video is worth 1.44 million words approximately. And if this video is 20 minutes long, this video is worth like 30 million words. I don't know if I've written that much in my life. It's a lot of words. So again, neurotypical versus psychotypical, I think really is ultimately most useful right now to think of it in terms of 2 televisions and 2 separate rooms that are the exact same model of television. They both function just fine, but they're playing 2 different movies of 2 different genres with 2 different people watching them who have 2 different, ways of thinking about the universe and 2 different preferences about movies and so on and so forth. Republicans and Democrats, is one neurotypical and one neuroatypical? Or are they just psychodivergent? Or are they neurodivergent because they have 2 different views of politics? Or are they psychodivergent because their brains really could both be just as healthy as each other, and yet they think about politics differently? Or 2 people that both have healthy brains and they speak 2 different languages? Or 2 people with healthy brains and one's a Buddhist and one's a Catholic? Or 2 different people with healthy brains. I hope you get the point. So again, neurotypical versus neurodivergent versus psychotypical versus psychodivergent. And tomorrow I might change my language. I just have been trying to think of an alternative to neurotypical, and just recently psychotypical dawned upon me, which again, I did not invent because I searched for it in Google and it had a few results, in the hundreds to maybe 1,000, far fewer than neurotypical versus neurodivergent. So that's what I'm trying to communicate. Again, this video is not perfect, but I hope, again, I think there's 7 billion humans on this earth. And if I post this online, I think this might resonate with some humans. So I'm going to probably post it anyway. And if you don't like it, well, I hope you think long and hard about why you don't like this video. And I hope you read the book Psychiatric Slavery by psychiatrist Thomas Saz. And that's all I got to say right now. I'm pretty much done. Thanks for watching. Watch my other videos, visit my websites, do whatever, have a nice life, limitless peace, serenity, so on and so forth. Read books by psychiatrist Thomas Saz. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, or night, whenever and wherever you may be. Cheers, limitless peace.